Hello and welcome to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. I'm Catherine Tomlinson and I founded Oxford Clay, an eco-conscious pottery company. So on this podcast, we're going to be talking about all things pottery related, often with an eco-conscious twist, and I can't wait to share it with you. Let's go. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Oxford Clay Pottery Podcast. And today's episode is going to be about plaster disasters. What we'll do is we'll just talk first of all about plaster, what it's used for in pottery, and then we'll go into some plaster disasters, which I've actually had all of them. So hopefully I can tell you what I did wrong, and then it will, stop you from doing the same. But the unfortunate thing about plaster is it sets and then it never goes back. So it's prone to a lot of disasters. That's what I'm saying. So plaster and pottery. What on earth do you use plaster for in pottery? They're not the same and they don't mix, which we'll go into in the next section. So plaster of Paris, the white plaster you see, for kind of like model making, and you can get ceiling moulds made out of it, the ceiling roses made out of it. So it's used in decorating, it's used in crafts, but in pottery, it's used for mould making. So that's if you basically are slip casting, you make a kind of mould from plaster, and then you would fill it with your liquid slip, and then the plaster draws the water out, and then your pot then kind of comes out, because when the water's removed from the clay, it will shrink, and then it allows your pot to come out. So it's not just for slip casting plaster moulds. You can also do hump moulds, and that's when you roll a piece of clay out, and then you put it, rest it on top of a kind of hump of plaster, and that makes a kind of that will create a shape for your clay, and it doesn't stick because the plaster is all the time drawing the water away from the clay, and then it allows the two surfaces to separate. Or you can do press moulds as well, where you're pressing clay into a plaster shape, and again the clay will shrink and then it will come out. And you can do press moulds as kind of like big bowls as well, or dishes, all sorts of shapes. So that's one way that plaster is used in pottery. And another way it's used, again, it's used for drawing the water out of clay. So you might, if you go to an evening class, pottery evening class, or you might even have this in your own studio or something. It's basically a big slab of plaster, and what potters do is they put their clay that they want to reclaim. So the clay which is very wet from reclaiming, they'll put that on a massive slab of plaster. The one I used to see in the pottery studio that I used to go to evening classes in was this huge slab of plaster. So they were reclaiming so much clay. So, an evening class, several evening classes, one in the early afternoon, one in the evening, there was one in the morning. So, several adult education classes in that pottery studio, and they got through so much clay, they just had to have this huge plaster slab to dry the reclaimed clay out. So basically it's dried on this big slab of plaster, and water gets sucked out of the clay, and then it will just peel straight off the plaster slab. So plaster is so useful in pottery. It's kind of like this magical, the clay and plaster are just best friends that can make these beautiful things together. But there's also so many things that can go wrong with plaster, which brings us on to the next section, which is I'm going to talk to you about 5 plaster disasters involving plaster, and how you can avoid them. Okay, So the first thing to say about plaster and clay is that it's really, really important to keep them separate. So obviously not when you're, making something with your plaster mould, but if any plaster, any little tiny bits of plaster, plaster dust, plaster chips get into clay, it can make the clay explode in the kiln. So quite often in a pottery studio, you'll have like the plaster section, like that studio I was talking to you about, where, the adult education one, they used to keep plaster in a whole separate section to the pottery, to all the clay, in the pottery studio. Plaster was one end, clay was the other, and that was to avoid any like cross contamination. So when your plaster is already, water's added and the chemical reaction has taken place, and it's now, hard, obviously there's less chance of it going into clay, but still tiny pieces can sometimes chip off. So it's super important, just like never let plaster get into your clay, otherwise like they explode in the kiln basically, which you don't want. Okay, so the next plaster disaster that I've had, so all of these ones actually, all of these ones involve when I'm actually making a plaster mould. So I want to show you a plaster mould, just so you know what one looks like. Just one second. Okay, so this is a plaster mould, and if you're listening on the podcast, I'm basically holding up, it's like a plaster block with kind of the indentation shape of a bowl, and what happens is, the slip gets poured into the bowl shape, and then it's poured out again, and then the shape can be removed. So to make this plaster mould shape, you obviously have to mix up some plaster. So there's several things that can go wrong when you mix up plaster, and I want to tell you about them so that it doesn't happen to you. So the first one is that it's really important to use cold water when you're mixing your plaster up, which I found out once. When I used hot water and the plaster set really, really quickly. So quickly, in fact, that I couldn't actually make the moulds. I had this basically bucket of plaster that had set before I could even pour the plaster around, my thing that I was making the mould out of. So that's my first top tip, is basically to always use cold water for mixing your plaster up. Okay, so when mixing plaster up, my second top tip is to mix it really, really well. Okay, so I actually learned this in a book on slip casting and mould making by Andrew Martin. And Andrew Martin talks about how plaster needs to be really, really well mixed. Otherwise it can go like grainy when you actually cast something. And you really don't want a grainy mould, because that surface will then be transferred to your slip cast pot. So you want your mould to be like super smooth, and the way to get super smooth plaster is to mix it really, really well. So I think in his book, Andrew Martin suggests using like a paddle mixer or something. But if you're making up smaller amounts of plaster, you can use one of those stick blenders, or you can just mix it really, really fast. But it's super important to make sure it's really, really well mixed before you pour the plaster, to get the right kind of like very fine surface on your plaster mould. Okay, so my third top tip is that it's really important to have the right ratio of plaster to water. And I found out this the hard way. When I just mixed up, I can't even remember what ratio I used, but it definitely wasn't 2-1. So it was basically I used too much water, and the plaster was really, really soft. And for mould making, you need your plaster to be super strong and super hard wearing, because it's going to be, you're going to use it all the time for slip casting. So you need it to be really, really strong. You don't want any little bits to be falling off it. So now I've learned to use a ratio of twice as much plaster to 1 water. So 2 parts plaster, 1 water, and then that makes, sometimes then add a teeny weeny bit more water depending on, how thick it is. That will get you a really good, really hard plaster that won't, little bits won't break off. Okay, so then my next top tip is to, so when you're making a plaster mould, you need to contain the plaster in a certain area. Okay, so what a lot of people do is they use wooden boards. If you're making quite a big mould, you quite often use wooden boards and you clamp them together with, say, like a G clamp or something, and then you have to seal it really, really well, the area, so that the plaster doesn't run out when you pour it into the mould. So my top tip is that even though it can look sealed, so basically you can go around all the edges with like clay, you're pushing the clay into all the cracks, the cracks between like the wooden planks and stuff. Even though you can do that, when you pour the plaster in, it can still find a hole because it's like a liquid and it will run out all over the floor, or all over your table. So that's very common for that to happen. Andrew Martin actually in his book on slip casting and mould making talks about a plaster disaster that he had, where he basically kept on pouring the plaster in and thought, this is weird, it's just keeping on going, and then realized the plaster was just like flowing out all over the table. So it happens like to the best of us. But what I've found is that a really good top tip for stopping this happening is to actually make a really contained area for your plaster mould. So you can effectively cast inside either a Tupperware pot or a bucket, and then there's no chance of the plaster going anywhere. So just to give you kind of an indication of like what I mean by this, let me show you this. So this was the mould I showed you before, and I'm holding up basically a mould which is like a square shape, and this was actually cast inside a square Tupperware pot, and that meant that when I poured the plaster in, there was nowhere for it to go. It had, the bowl at the bottom that was getting cast. I poured the plaster in on top in the plastic tub. There was nowhere for it to go. It made a really nice, smooth sides because the plaster was contained in a smooth Tupperware pot. And it meant that it didn't run everywhere. And I also didn't have to build, a frame with G-clamps and stuff. I could just basically pour it into a Tupperware pot and then, wait for the plaster to set and then turn it out. And it was great. So those are my top tips. Keep your plaster away from clay to avoid explosions. Don't use hot water or your plaster will set incredibly quickly, probably before you can even pour it. Mix it really, really well to get a smooth plaster rather than grainy one. Make sure you don't add too much water, or make sure your ratio of plaster to water is 2 parts plaster to 1 part water, and I do that in weight. Also, if you're going to be making a mould, a slip casting mould, if you're pouring plaster anywhere, use a contained area like a bucket or a Tupperware pot, and you won't have like plaster all over your floor and table. And this might, I don't know, this is probably like an extra bonus tip, but you might know this already, but do not, under any circumstances, pour plaster down the sink, because it will like completely block your sink. So once it's gone through that chemical reaction, it turns hard, and that's it, and there's no way of like undoing that. So don't pour it down the sink. If you're cleaning a bucket or something, you can just kind of wipe the bucket with newspaper to kind of get rid of most of the plaster, or you can give your bucket a wash and maybe pour it, like if you have a garden or something, you can pour it outside, or if you don't, you can, like I said, wipe it all out with like kitchen roll. So don't pour it down the sink. I haven't done that mistake, but I've done all the others.
Yeah, so I hope this has helped you with your, if you're going to be making anything to do with plaster, plaster and clay, they're, like I said, like best friends, and they can really help each other. Plaster helps clay, put it that way. Yeah, I hope this episode has been helpful for you, and I'll see you next time. Happy potting!
So if you liked that and you're interested in learning more about pottery, eco-conscious pottery, tools and techniques for potters, there's so much for you on the Oxford Clay website. There's blogs, ebooks, e-courses, video courses, and I can't wait to see you there. So the website is www.oxfordclay.co.uk.